scary to say this, but I would be the first member of Congress with direct experience regulating emerging technology out of the 435 members.
Yeah.
We don't have anyone that has experience regulating tech. And that's something that we need to change. And it doesn't have to be some kind of draconian policy that stifles innovation. That's not what I mean. I mean responsible development, providing healthy guardrails. Trump the fears of many, and whether it's voters in favor of him or voters against him, he embodies the fear of many. And so that is often what the Biden administration has to go up against, is the emotional side of things, the fear that he invokes. And unfortunately, it's a really hard thing to combat.
So I had the pleasure of having a conversation with one of my good friends, Travis Nembhard, who's running for Congress in Virginia. If elected, he'll be the only congressperson in the House with experience working in the regulatory space as it relates to tech. He's a father, he's a husband. We talk about politics, we talk about raising a family, and we talk about what it's like running for Congress. You know, it's not very often that you hear conversations from people who are seeking to be lawmakers that are as personal as this. So I really do hope you guys enjoy. So like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you. All right, welcome to Uncovered with Derrick James. I'm here today with Travis Nembhard, who's running for Congress in Virginia's 10th district. What's up, man? How are you?
I'm good.
I'm glad you're here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for bearing with the setup.
No.
Yeah, man. So, first and foremost, man, I wanted to bring you on because, you know, you're a friend. You're somebody I've known we've sort of been acquainted for a little while.
Yeah.
And I guess we sort of reconnected at a Democratic event, and I was super surprised to see that you were the guy who they said was running for Congress in Virginia. And I'm glad we were able to reconnect. And yeah, man. So tell us, I guess, what's up, man? I mean, I think. Well, first, let's start with
Yeah.
So you're running this race in Virginia. Can you talk about what you ran previously somewhere in another district, or?
Well, the House of Delegates.
House of Delegates.
Yeah.
That's right. And you were running for delegate. And when was this? 2020.
This was last year.
Last year. That's right. That's right. So what made you kind of get back in? Right.
So I'll give you the short story of it. Jumped into this race really because I didn't feel that we were going to have someone that truly represented what we embodied as a community, and so I decided to run very last minute, 3 weeks before the filing deadline, and we ended up doing really well. Raised $2.4 million. We had outperformed President Biden in the district by 14 points. Did really well for Democrats in what was a tough district. And then we had the highest youth early vote turnout in the state. So did really well, felt really good about it. And ultimately, after finishing that race where we lost by just a little over 1,000 votes, so it was very close, that district is embedded within the Congressional. And so after doing a lot of soul searching, talking to the wife, making sure that everything is good, decided to take that leap of faith and to run for this seat.
Yeah, always got to check in with the wife, man.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So this is your second race. But I guess before we even get into that, man, can you talk about where you're from, who you are? Introduce yourself to people.
Yeah. So I'm originally from New York, from Long Island. I actually grew up in a town called Hempstead in the first quarter of my childhood, predominantly Black Latino community, and we ended up moving out to a town called Comac, predominantly white, conservative, and we were one of the first African American families out there. And so that was quite the experience, and it was an adjustment. I'm the middle child, I'm one of 5, and really I felt like I came at a good time in middle school. Like beginning middle school, I was really able to adapt to the scenario, but I was still very aware of the changing dynamic. I went on to go to Binghamton University for undergrad, majoring in financial economics, and then I went on to law school immediately after. There, I was at Villanova Law, and there I focused on corporate securities law. Graduated after spent having the honor of working in the Obama administration in the White House, in the Office of White House Counsel, and really knew I was committed to public service. So since then, I've dedicated my career to public service. I was working as Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Bureau in Manhattan. After that, complex white-collar crime investigations at FINRA. Then as a legislative counsel in D.C., working on transportation and environmental matters. And then after that, became the youngest judge in D.C. as an administrative law judge in D.C., working on consumer protection-related matters, touching the for-hire space, which includes ride share, food and parcel, that sort of thing. And then now I'm head of our enforcement division related to enforcing basically the gig economy in D.C.
Nice, man. So how does a kid from Hempstead sort of, navigate, how does a kid from Hempstead sort of get to where you are today, where you have not only the aspirations to do these things, but you actually accomplish them and sort of really make a name for yourself? Because considering how old are you?
I'm 20. I'm 20. Yeah,
Wish.
30. Yeah, exactly. 35.
35
Yeah.
with that sort of resume. So there obviously is a drive behind that. So can you talk about just a bit about, I guess, whatever, I guess childhood, but really what is it that sort of fueled you? What has fueled you to continue to do this? And then why public service?
Yeah, so it's a pretty complex, I guess, picture, but I would say there are some big overarching factors. One is my parents are both immigrants from Jamaica, and they really worked their way up from a small apartment in New York City out to Long Island. 5 of my brothers plus I, so that's 6 of us. And ultimately, me and my brothers watched my parents really work to give us a better life. And I think what really brought that home for me was when I went to Jamaica with my brothers to see where my father and my mother grew up, especially my dad, the humble beginnings. It was a different life. And knowing that I would never have to work as hard as he did to be able to give us the opportunity that we have. And there's just a desire for me to help people, anyone who I feel needs a helping hand. And it's not quite something I can explain why it's there. It's just always been there. But that drive is something that I think motivates me every day, because I know that there is someone out there that's hurting, that's someone out there that works hard, but they haven't had an opportunity. I see how just as easily for me, I had opportunities that had those opportunities not occurred, I could have been in a different picture and a different situation. Yeah. So I would say that's a big driving force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you talk about, I know that during the first campaign event I've gone to of yours, you tell the story about working in the AG's office in New York, and then by day, and then by night, you're working in Dunkin' Donuts. Can you talk about that dichotomy? And again, that goes back to the drive, and there aren't a lot of people that would do that, right? There just aren't.
Yeah.
So it's just I'm just curious to know sort of you could put us there. Like, what was it like waking up in the morning, seemingly wearing something like this, and then working on these very, very important cases, and as a public servant you working with Kristen Clark.
That's right.
Who actually a mutual former boss of ours. But what was it like to get up in the morning and just kind of know that your day was going to be that?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that a lot of people really surprised at me doing it. And for me, the reality was I felt this was something I had to do. I didn't really feel like there was an option. The goal was to do a job that I was passionate about, and how do I make it work? And the only way to make it work was to work overnight. So, I would wake up in the morning, I would commute an hour in on the LIRR, that's Long Island Railroad, and then take a 30-minute subway ride down to Wall Street, and would go in and work full time. I would do depositions about landlord abuses, slumlords regarding their tenants, negotiations with a Fortune 100 company, different things of that nature. I had my own office with a window and all of those things, but no salary, you know. But it was a phenomenal opportunity. I worked with, as you had mentioned, Kristen. I've also worked with Alvin Bragg, who's now the Manhattan DA, and just phenomenal attorneys that I had an opportunity to work with and build relationships that I still have today. And for me, after at the end of the day, I would head home, same hour and a half back, and then maybe grab a snack, suit up for Dunkin' Donuts, and go there and work. You know, I was actually when I got that job, I was extremely happy, because coming out of law school, it was very hard to get a retail job to supplement that income, because people saw your resume and they said, "Oh, like, I'm not hiring you." So when this lady who owns the or was managing that Dunkin' Donuts said, "Hey, we're thinking about opening 24/7. We need someone who can work overnight," I was thrilled, because this was an opportunity for me to be able to pay those bills while doing what I was passionate about, and that is helping people.
Wow, man. So I'm thinking about that hour and a half there and back, and I know that. So when I worked for Clifton Clark, I worked in DC for the Lawyers Committee, but I lived in Baltimore. Okay. So I took about an hour and 20-minute ride to and fro every day. And Kristen is one of the most brilliant people I've ever had the pleasure of working with, and probably the hardest person I've ever met in my entire life. And so during those trips, I was mostly working. And as I got more comfortable with the job and in a better place, I started using that as an opportunity to kind of think. So like, what did you do during that hour and a half? So you might have just worked, but like,
that's a good question. Yeah. I've never been asked that. What did I think about? I guess it depended on the day. Yeah. I mean, really just thinking about, I think one of the challenges was, how do I make this work? And I think long-term it wasn't sustainable. So I do think that a lot of that was either thinking about how I'm going to make it work, taking a nap, because usually on average between the jobs I got 4 hours of sleep. So my only fear was falling asleep and missing my stop. So I didn't really do that often. But I think really trying to think logistically, how am I going to make this work? How am I going to, all I needed to do was make just enough to cover my expenses, and I was good, Nice. But for me, I would say that was probably, I'm sure I thought about other things, but I never really thought and reflected about what it exactly is that I thought about on that train.
I mentioned, for me, it was living in Baltimore. I worked, prior to working for the Lawyers Committee, I worked at the Baltimore City Community College. Okay. And so it's so many folks there are subjugated socially, economically, and it was a hard place to work. So I actually left Lawyers Committee, went to Baltimore City Community College, and then was like, I can't do this. And Kristen was like, you want to come back? And I was like, yes. So I ended up moving to Baltimore from DC, and then switching, and then living in Baltimore, working in DC. Okay. For me, it was this weird sort of the similar dichotomy in that I was being in Baltimore in the city, and sort of without getting too deep into sort of the reputation Baltimore has and all those things, you're just witnessing just poverty and violence and drugs, and then so for me, that ride to DC was it became a sort of a fantasy. Like it gave me the opportunity. It gave me a long enough opportunity to really think about what it was I was doing, and it gave me a sense of purpose. Because I felt like, well, I'm playing a very, very small part in helping those folks in the neighborhood that I was living in at the time. And so it really, for me, it was enlightening, and it was very invigorating, and kind of gave me the energy and the fuel that I needed to do that working with that person who works very, 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 very hard. So man. So you have 2 kids,
Yep.
a wife.
Two that keep us busy.
I'm almost like, I'm so like interested, if you can't tell by our casual conversations, like what you know, many lawmakers do interviews and debates and all the things, but you don't really hear about what is it like to be, to run, to be, you know, to do a campaign.
Yeah.
Day to day, what is it, you know?
Day to day. Yeah, I mean, I would say that the day to day, it depends on what your scenario, your situation is. For me, I work a full-time job, so my day to day is I go to work in the morning, or I do a briefing in the morning with my campaign manager before work, start work, lunch break, call time for fundraising, back to work, and as soon as I get out of work, I commute back home. My commute's about an hour. I do call time on the way home. My finance director helps with that, so I don't have to dial the numbers. But nonetheless, you know, doing that, I get home, go right inside. I see the little ones, which makes my day. Seeing Stephanie and the kids, and they're excited. Do that for about 5 minutes, hugging them, playing with the little ones, and then I go right back in the office and I do call time. Other days, I will go to events. There are a lot of times events at night. Some are virtual, which are convenient, but some are in person. And then weekends are usually events. Yeah. So that's, I mean, that's pretty much it day to day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you call yourself a person who, so when I think about doing a campaign or being a person who is, going for the seat, you know, the first thing I think is, man, I don't know if I'd be able to have that many conversations, you know, speak to that many people, interact with that many folks. Is it something that do you remember people and faces and?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that one's might be a little unique for me because I've always been known by my family to have a very good memory.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it used to be history and biology, right? Like I still think back to like the parts of a cell, and like and the endoplasmic reticulum, and the ribosomes that are in the like just random stuff. But I remembered very early on the parts of the body, including the parts of the heart and the brain. And then historical facts was a big thing for me. It was just something I was able to recall. That went away for a while where I wasn't really focused on remembering a lot of things except for the regular day-to-day stuff. Yeah. And when I did finance calls, there were times where, for example, my team would be like, oh, next up is so-and-so. And I would be like, we called them like about 2 weeks ago. You know, yeah, and they were like, I don't know, and they would check this, and they're like, yeah, I guess we have duplicate entry, and I'm like, I'm telling you, and in many cases there would be situations like that, or when I'm knocking on doors, every door that I see that I've knocked, I can recall the conversation that I had with those individuals as long as I can see that house. Now there's some situations where there's similar looking communities, and so I may try to remember, like, was that in Manassas or was that in Gainesville, like the suburbs? But once I see the home, I can remember, the conversation we had.
Wow, dude, my memory is so bad. My wife told me I really should consider seeing if I have like some brain degeneration going on, early onset Alzheimer's. Man, that's amazing. But that will serve you well. Yeah, well, let's get into the race. Right. So you jumped in the race. Yeah. There is no incumbent, right?
No. Well,
sorry.
Yeah. So Congresswoman Wexton is our current member of Congress. She's a phenomenal legislator. Was there for me last year when I ran for the House of Delegates. Very supportive. Came out multiple times, and was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Yeah. So she decided not to run for re-election. Okay. I can't imagine what kind of struggles that's bringing right now. It's very hard, and I'm sure she really is trying to spend as much time with family as she can. I mean, my heart goes out to them for that. but yeah, she's not running for re-election, and so right now we have a primary, and that primary consists of a number of folks that are running to I guess try to fill those very large shoes.
Yeah. So if you make it, which you would, when you make it to Congress, what do you feel like? What's first up on your docket?
Yeah. So there's a lot that I want to do, but I would say that for me, the compass is working families, and that includes working individuals, right? Everyone that it's tied to, there's at the core crux of it, working families. So making sure that we're dealing with protecting women's rights.
Yeah.
That's something that has been under attack lately.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, making sure to codify and work to protect that. Also, dealing with paid family leave and universal child care. We know how hard our moms worked and work, and the reality is that I can't imagine me being married and having my wife, and we're able to team up and work together to manage our kids. We struggled. We made it work, but I can't imagine what their parents out there who are either single parents or trying to really navigate even with income levels that really don't meet the expectations they need for childcare. How do they make it work? And that plays into the educational system. It has long-term implications, and so, like I said, paid family leave, universal child care. Education, making sure equal access to education and protecting workers' rights. There are people in Virginia here still who do not have access to sick leave, right? And they earned it, but they don't have access to it. And so making sure people can have earned sick leave, so when a pandemic happens or when something happens, they can take care of themselves or their family members and don't have to choose between their health and being able to provide.
Yeah, I think it's, my wife and I talk about this all the time. We're blessed now, but we've had, most of our time together has been, financially difficult because of the jobs that we chose to get. We wanted to be, to give back and do things that we were passionate about. My wife was an immigration I don't know her title, but essentially she was like the first line of defense and knowledge for folks who were coming, undocumented folks, and providing them resources and navigating them through the asylum process. And I've worked, for Chris. I think about this particular moment in our time in our relationship where she was pregnant. Before we had our first daughter. I worked at the Lawyers Committee actually, and I'll never forget. I'd been there for about 10 and a half months. And I didn't have any leave, any vacation time, and the only leave I had was unpaid. And I remember Kristen galvanized the staff to donate their vacation time so I could spend a few weeks with my wife after pregnancy. And I remember my wife's reaction. Because she was a little younger than me, and she had one job for a bunch of years and just didn't experience that, and she just could not fathom how a father, wasn't given any allocated time to be with his child and also be able to support sort of the postnatal process financially, and it's something that is a reality for so many Americans, and navigating sort of just that, and then the costs around insurance, and it's just I'm kind of rambling because my wife and I had a conversation just last night, and we were talking budget, and we're talking about things we have to kind of put away and things we have to add. My daughter just got invited to be on a traveling gymnastics team, so that's another $7 million. But we were just talking, we have these conversations just as a married couple about, hey, if I get sick, what happens? If you get sick, what happens? And we're only a sickness away from losing our home, our car, not being able to have insurance for our children, not being able to afford daycare, and it just shouldn't be that way. And I feel like our generation, and especially just Generation Z, we're fed up because it doesn't have to be this way. Or does it? I
No,
mean,
it doesn't have to be this
yeah.
way. I mean, we see it happening around the globe where, especially in Europe, you have developed nations that are providing policies that are far more family friendly than what we have here in the U.S. And, the reality is there's a balance to be struck, but we are definitely not anywhere close to striking that balance right now. And a lot of working families are suffering for it. Yeah.
I love that. I think that we're in a climate now where you have the Republican Party using, as they've done for decades, using sort of the American family itself as the pitch to America to elect them. And so I love the fact that you're doing it. Your platform is more of a real practical application of what's happening. So instead of you're not, when Republicans talk about family first, it's mostly tied with social issues and those sorts of things that I won't get into. But there's no substance behind it. I think people care more about. I would like to think people care more about being able to afford their medicine and being able to afford to put their children in daycare than they do about maybe having to a unisex bathroom, right?
Well, yeah, let me give you an example I used on the campaign trail. A lot of times, a lot of the Republican lawmakers talk about tax cuts. Let's cut taxes, right? It'll save you money. But the reality is that what they're not saying, and this is, whether it's from my background with financial economics or just my experience in general, the reality is that at most, that tax cut is going to save an average family maybe $300, maybe max. Let's say it saves them $1,000
for the year.
When they file their taxes, right? They tax cut, they save $1,000. We pass paid family leave, right? Or let's say, actually, better example would be universal child care. Universal child care, the average cost in Northern Virginia for child care is around $2,300 to $2,500 a month. Just think about that.
Sounds about right.
So you multiply that over 12 months, right? Compared to that $1,000 tax cut for the year, it doesn't compare. It pales in comparison. When you talk about, as you said, medication costs, again, pales in comparison. What they're trying to do is sell the argument that a short-term lump sum is better than a long-term larger sum, and so the reality is that we have to make sure to communicate that to families and help them understand that in reality, the policies that we're promoting save them more money in the long term.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's the sort of the, I'm in communications, and I do political communications, and I've been in it for about maybe, almost 15 years at this point. I'm old. And I have not seen, as a person who is hired to do messaging communications, I still don't see that the party explains thoroughly in a digestible fashion those sorts of things, which you just described. And I think that we have an issue. We have these. This country now has a tendency to focus on things that are, on social issues. And I think that there are practical issues that affect everyday Americans that if they just knew how it worked or explained, hey, no, you don't want your taxes cut. I would think that people would be, I think that people are open to it. I just don't think that there's a real medium or individual or entity that is consistently explaining and countering talking points from the other side.
Yeah, I mean, the Affordable Care Act was a prime example. You had people saying, "Oh, Obamacare is bad," and then they asked, "What did you think of Affordable Care Act?" "Oh, I like that." The messaging was part of it, and that showed a clear example of that. Even the more recent discussion about immigration, right? And we talk about how, like, what would the cost that it has to society when we don't insure individuals, whether it be migrants or just individuals in general, is far greater, right? Those individuals, when they don't have insurance, they're going to wait till it's a more serious ailment. Then they go to the hospital. Hospitals are wildly inefficient as it relates to the costs that it brings as an expense for fixing things. You just go there for a Band-Aid and it's going to cost you $1,000, right? So at the end of the day, you have people going to the hospitals. They're waiting till a minor ailment becomes a major one. And the taxpayers have to pay for that when those individuals aren't insured. And what people aren't talking about is the fact that when they insure those individuals, whether they be migrants or Americans that can't afford insurance, yes, they are paying upfront a cost, which is the equivalent of what would be a premium. But at the end of the day, it offsets the cost as it relates to the full cost of the procedure or whatever is going on. And so instead of it costing $40,000 for a procedure that someone had to undergo, or more in many other cases, it's going to cost the average person the average taxpayer $8,000 per person to the government. So the government would cost the government maybe $8,000 a year per individual to cover, as opposed to the procedure, which would have costed $40,000 and is way more expensive. And some procedures go into the hundreds of thousands. So at the end of the day, people are thinking about that upfront cost again, instead of thinking about the long-term savings that can be had.
Yeah. Speaking of that, man, speaking of the sort of the migrant crisis, as the media is calling it, there, I think we've seen, I've seen a number of news outlets do these focus groups with black folks in whatever state, Georgia or some battleground state. And I don't know if they're hand-selected or if they're randomly selected, but they're trying to drive the point home that African Americans are wholly against or unhappy with the impact that the seeming impact or the alleged impact that this crisis is having on them, their families, their livelihoods. I think when you look at it from a 10,000 foot perspective, there seems to be a systemic effort, because it's newsworthy to say, hey, black folks are angry with Biden, they're going to vote for Trump because of this migrant crisis, and it plays into what the Republicans are doing, and as they should, if they want to win. But do you feel, or do you see in your travels that sentiment that black folks especially are just not happy with Biden, some of his policies? And
yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to any other group. We have our diverse opinions on things, but I would say that most, or a lot of the black voters that I've talked to, they're still concerned about civil rights. They're still concerned about the accurate teaching of history and making sure that history doesn't repeat itself. Right? There are bigger threats in their minds than a tax cut or any of the other things that they're talking about. I do think, as it relates to the migrant crisis, it is something that many Americans are concerned about, and there is a desire to see something done. And that I agree. We need to do stuff, and some of the things we can do are really working to clean up our immigration system. I think, to your point as to the migrant crisis, some of it is also exacerbated by the way it's being done by the southern states that are behaving in that way. That Florida and Texas come to mind, where they're busing individuals statewide to particular city localities, right? And so you're trying to cram in all of the migrants that are within a state as large as Texas, for example, in a few hand-picked cities. No city is going to be able to handle that, whether there's a crisis or not. But those people in those cities are going to feel that, right? And to their credit, many of those mayors are trying their best to bring some sense of humanity to how they handle and work with the migrants. It's not perfect, right? And I'm sure there's other ways in which we'll figure out how to manage those things, at least on the local level. But they're trying to do the best they can to treat them as humans. They're people, and I think that oftentimes what's problematic with the rhetoric is that it talks about undocumented immigrants as though they are not, they're other, right? And I think that's a dangerous practice, because we have seen in the past what happens when humans start to detach their humanity from others. So,
Is there a legal or legislative mechanism that allows them to bus people from one location to the next who are undocumented? It seems like there needs to be some legal mechanism to even allow that.
to not allow that?
To allow that. It seems like you can't just pick up. Like, I couldn't just go, grab someone off the street just because they're undocumented and take them to Massachusetts, right? At least I don't think I could.
Well, there's argument, and that's being, I guess, settled in the courts to some extent, whether it's a form of trafficking. Exactly. But we'll see where courts come out on that. I just think from a moral standpoint, it's just not right to be, again, shuffling people around as though they're property.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would say that the jury's out on that.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Speaking of morality and working families, as a freshman congressman, there are some, congressperson, there are certainly many, many limitations. But you see people who are seemingly effective. Yeah. So without knowing the politics of a Cory Booker, without knowing the politics of an AOC, I think the average person would think that they were effective because, I would say Cory Booker in his time when he was very popular. But I think about an AOC and the other freshman crew that came in with her. Yeah. I think the average person has a perception that they are a powerful, especially their people who are opposed to the AOC believe that she's this very powerful congresswoman. Yeah. But can you talk about just generally, like, what can a freshman member of Congress do to be effective, impactful?
Yeah, I think that I can't speak to what freshman members of Congress have done in the past, but what I can do is speak to how I plan to leverage my role. Number one, I think that irrespective of what happens in the dysfunction of Congress, we need to revolutionize how members of Congress interact with the local level. Right? Right now, we have two silos. We have the federal government, and then we got the local, state and local. And there's very little communication between the two. And one of the things that I want to do is leverage my role as a member of Congress to help support those government actors, those officials on the local and state level, to help empower them to be more effective. It just by nature of the job, members of Congress have more access to capital and resources than a member of the school board, for example, right? And really allowing myself to step in and help those individuals who are struggling to find those resources and empowering them. That's something that I would do, number one, right? And that's something I can start on day one. And you don't see it often, where members of Congress are wading into things down to the school board level. So that's number one. Number two, I had mentioned I grew up the second half of my childhood in a predominantly white conservative town as one of the few black members of the community. And the first day of class, kids wanted to touch my hair because they never interacted with a black kid before, right? And they, that was a new experience for them. Your hair is different. Fast forward to high school, I had stories of parents who I knew and who were otherwise nice individuals when interacting with them, but stories of them saying things like get this N-word stuff out of here to their kids, my friends, and the reality is that I had to navigate those biases, prejudice, and the political differences. I'm pretty sure Comac went for Trump, right? To give you context, but at the end of the day, that had allowed me to thrive in the race I ran last year in a district that, quite frankly, Democrats wrote off as unwinnable seat. Wow. And that progress was made. I had people who said they hadn't voted for 40 years for a Democrat and cast a ballot. I got an email from a military veteran who said, "You're the first person that came to my door in 30 years, and because of that, my family and I were going to be voting for you," right? And they were conservative, but the reality is that the conversations we had allowed us to break down barriers that often come up, and it's often a miscommunication. Yeah. Because we all want the same thing. We want to be safe. We want our kids to get a good education. We want to be able to put food on the table, and we want to be able to put a roof over our house, right? I mean, put a roof over our heads. And so at the end of the day, that for me is something that I work very hard to do, is to bring that sense of commonality. And that's what I plan to do in the halls of Congress, and work with individuals who can still be worked with to get things done.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I feel like we're getting to know each other generally, but one thing that I really admire, and I mean, is you have a level of serenity, at least outwardly, and what looks like patience. I don't want to speak for your personality, but patience and the willingness to be open and have actual, like, real substantive conversation. So I just see you knocking on the door and actually spending 30 minutes, half an hour with someone, right? Which I think a lot of, I think that there's a sense that, you have the voters and then you have the candidate or the lawmaker, and there's this huge distance between them. And you don't hear folks running for Congress really interacting and speaking with folks at the local level of priority. And so I think that's just really dope, man. Speaking of one of your platform items, I have a lot of conversations now. It's actually really interesting. I think as people use AI, especially what is it, ChatGPT, and I'm not familiar with all that stuff, the video and picture stuff. Folks are now having more conversation about how amazing it is, and thus the sort of the dangers of it. And I know myself, I know less about the actual product and I'm more interested in actually, what does this mean for the future of humanity? What does it mean immediately for jobs? What does it mean for families? What does it mean for the economy? What does it mean for our physical health? Are we safe? Do they have control over this? And I know that you're making tech. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but tech regulations, or regulating tech a priority.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary to say this, but I would be the first member of Congress with direct experience regulating emerging technology. Out of the 435 members, we don't have anyone that has experience regulating tech. And that's something that we need to change. And it doesn't have to be some kind of draconian policy that stifles innovation. That's not what I mean. I mean responsible development, providing healthy guardrails, right? We need the equivalent of what is a Sarbanes-Oxley that came out and in the 1900s for the banking and finance sector.
Can you explain what that is?
Well, Sarbanes-Oxley, what it does is it basically puts into place protections to protect not shareholders, but individuals who are investors, instruct the financial system as a whole, it's similar to, it builds on itself just like other things like the Bank Secrecy Act.
Got it.
Which deals with more so money laundering, that sort of thing. And then you've got, but yes, so Sarbanes-Oxley is more like accounting principles. So that allows for, again, the protection of the financial system and making sure that there's protections in place that were kind of a blind side to the financial industry prior to it. Just like, the Securities Acts that came out in the 1920s and in 1933 as well. But at the end of the day, we need that on the tech side of things. We need a robust form of guardrails from a legislative standpoint to allow for ethical development, to support development of technology in a responsible way. And I think we see what's happening right now, showing the signs of how you can't regulate that which you don't understand. And if you have lawmakers that whole and cloth don't understand what regulating tech looks like, they talk about things like getting rid of an entire platform. They talk about things like how horrible tech is as with social media, et cetera. They have these great hearings, and then no laws come out of it, right? Because they don't know. They don't know how to regulate it, right? And there are unintended consequences that can come from individuals putting forth laws that don't fully understand the full extent to what they're doing. And so I think that's an important aspect, and that's something I plan to do, is to shepherd and lead many of my fellow members of Congress through that process and helping them understand what the implications are for things, not just from the perspective of lobbyists, but from the perspective of a colleague, and getting those protections in place. Yeah.
What do you think about what's happening with TikTok?
I think TikTok is the challenges that we're facing around TikTok and its ties to China. Of course, it's a national security concern. But I think a platform that has 1 billion active users, just get rid of it when you have whole businesses that rely on it, and industries. The President of the United States is using it for marketing, right? I mean, at the end of the day, getting rid of it is an extreme and pretty drastic measure. There's a lot in between that can be done.
Like
right?
what?
So there's data reporting that we can put into place, right? Reporting around what sorts of information the algorithms are relying on as factors, what sorts of information and data is being collected. We still need to catch up with Europe on data privacy, right? And with the reality is that now we saw that Europe just put out new legislation about regulating tech, and they said they're leading the charge, which is true because we're not doing anything right now. And so, at the end of the day, we are falling behind. There's a lot of things we can do, from the most basic stuff, like requiring that a company that has over $1 million in revenue require that all of their employees that have access to their software and their mainframe, their systems, have two-step authentication. Something as simple as that will stop dozens, if not hundreds, of hacks. Because at the end of the day, you have a situation where people are being victimized by phishing schemes. But guess what? If they get the password and they enter it, and they don't have the device with the two-step authentication, game over. They can try to log in all they want, but that person's going to get notified. You've put in a request. Here's your PIN to enter, and they're going to say, no, that's not me. And then the reality is that it increases the likelihood that those attempts at hacks get caught, and it stops it.
Yeah.
But that's a basic, very simple rule, right, that you could put into place, and it's not burdensome on businesses. To the more complex, where you can utilize the underpinning of blockchain to help deal with the challenges around disinformation, and allowing that ledger technology to be able to help us determine where the source of news or information that's being purported to be news is coming from, so that people can look at that ledger and see where it came from. There's greater accountability when it comes to that, but also using tokens or digital watermarks, and creating a commission that will approve that watermark to be used for sources that claim to be news. Right. So there's a lot that we can do to go in and really change how things are done. Even creating an intra national internet that is used for some of the most sensitive information and things that we do not want to risk being taken out by foreign state actors, and creating that infrastructure to utilize that structure for things like autonomous vehicles, because we don't want autonomous vehicles being hacked and being used as weapons, right? So at the end of the day, there's a lot that can be done, but we need to have members of Congress that actually understand how to regulate technology.
Yeah. You would think that there were, staff that I was astounded on working on the Hill, how many folks, and this is no disrespect to anybody in particular, but how many folks were supposed to be subject matter experts, but they had so many different subjects in their docket that they didn't master any one thing, and so they didn't create relationships that they maybe could have really created if they were focused on one major issue. So they wouldn't even know to reach out to. They wouldn't know who to reach out to get the information. They wouldn't know what questions to even ask. And I obviously this is one of those. I just still find it astounding that you just named a few different measures that, that it seemingly those should be the conversations that are happening when they're spending hours in a freaking hearing on the Hill.
Yeah.
And I've sat through a few of those, and I left being more. It's almost like this weird esoteric language, but it's not esoteric because neither side really knows what they're talking about. Like like there's not like an inside conversation. I just don't understand it. It's like neither side. I know there's this famous viral video of I think Mark Zuckerberg was at a hearing, and they were asking him to describe something with privacy or something, and it was such a rote, like, basic question, and really what it came down to is that the congressman didn't really know how Facebook worked, so he was asking this really dumb question. But no, cool, man. So, so when you when I do my travels, and I work on both sides of the aisle now, which is interesting. Not particularly on any social issues, but so I think about the vast difference in perception when it comes to this administration and Biden. I find it astounding that you have folks that are saying, "Hey, he shouldn't be president because he, all the things that the media is saying about his memory, and which is unfortunate in his age." Then you have folks that are saying he is the most brilliant, president we've ever had. He's, he's an astute statesman and all these things. But the way the polls have been turning out recently, that folks are generally, a little bit. Democrats are concerned about age and ability to do the job, but then there's not a real affinity for the first woman, African American vice president. Which I find really interesting. What do you, in your opinion, looking at it from sort of the outside, but sort of you're on the outside because you're not in the administration, not working with the administration, but you are running for Congress. So essentially, potentially, God willing, he's reelected, and when you're in Congress, he will be your boss. Or I guess 2-part question: what are you experiencing again on the trail when it comes to voters you're talking to, if he even comes up, and what is your personal sort of opinion on sort of the future of this administration, just giving all the different factors?
So I'll take the second one first.
Yeah.
So I think part of that is it's coming down to messaging,
Okay.
right? Just like the Affordable Care Act was widely popular, but people just didn't know it. President Biden has done a tremendous amount for the country. See, people keep talking about how inflation is still high, but it's low relative to the rest of the global economies. People talk about how enough is not being done, but our economy has been stronger than it's been in recent history. We haven't hit a recession, even though people have been proclaiming a recession was going to be coming each year. And ultimately, we have a situation where things like the CHIPS Act is going to bring down inflation over time, but also bring back jobs that were often overseas, diversifying where our chips are being developed so that we're not reliant on just it being placed in Taiwan, where it could be one Chinese invasion away from a national security threat, where I think more than 80% of our chips are made. So at the end of the day, the infrastructure bill that he put forward, rallying Europe in a way that allowed us to really take on Russia when they were gearing up to invade Ukraine and during the process. And here's the funny thing. I felt so much pride when his administration came out and made the point to call it out, say Russia's going to invade. And everybody shrugged it off. I remember thinking the day before, people were having coffee, just like whatever, who cares? And it's unfortunate, but he was right, right? And I had so much pride because it reminded the world that we are a leader when it comes to information and trying to protect democracy. And we stepped up in a big way when no other information or other intelligence agencies were privy to it. It's like we were telegraphing his moves as though we were sitting in the room with him. Yeah. Right? And I know he must have been upset about that. But the key here is that President Biden was able to call that out. He held him to account, and he rallied Europe collectively. And now we have, potentially two countries join up with NATO. That NATO has been kind of strengthened in a way, but from a moral sense of being reminded what they were formed collectively as nations to do. They're being reminded of that right now, and unified by that. And so, I think in many ways he reasserted our position as a leader in the world. And I think that all of those things collectively are successes. And so at the end of the day, stocks are high, inflation has lowered. We are not in a recession, and jobs are growing. And at the end of the day, we are in a situation where we have to try to combat messaging. And so the first question that you had, I think what I'm hearing is not so much about President Biden, but there is a sense of frustration, especially among the youth. Often I'm hearing this from parents about their teenagers or their young adult kids, that they're not voting or they don't want to vote. They're essentially disaffected by the fact that they feel no one's really there representing their voice, right? And that is something that motivated me to run, because at the end of the day, I'm the youngest candidate in the race at 35, and I would be one of the youngest in Virginia's recent history, statewide, coming out of Virginia in Congress. But the key being that we had the highest youth vote in the state. I can't speak to some magical or some ingenious plan as to how we did it, other than those young folks saw me on TV or saw me in the ads and said, hey, I like his message. And I think he also, I can see him representing my voice because he's part of our generation, right? And able to bridge that gap. And so I have been fortunate in being able to accomplish a lot in a short period of time. Like I said, being the youngest judge in D.C., working as an assistant attorney general, working as a legislative counsel, touching all three branches, and being able to use that fortune, or the good fortune, to leverage my connection to my generation and the experiences they've had, really bridge that gap. And that's something that I want to do, and that's also why probably I would be the first with experience regulating tech, because at the end of the day, the average age of Congress is close to 60.
100.
close, close to 60. But at the end of the day, that's my motivating factor. Is I think when elected into the general, I will bring out the youth vote. I resonated with African Americans in my last race and the Latino community. I can speak Spanish, hold my own conversationally. My wife's Latina, and my sons are Latino, and she teaches ESOL and is very much connected to the plight of many of the folks who are migrants that have come and do not have access to the resources to acquire English as a primary language. And so at the end of the day, I've learned to essentially navigate those different groups that make up our core base as Democrats. And if, when someone taps into that and can draw those folks out, at the end of the day, we're in a position where we will get those voters in place to the polls so that they can help get President Biden across the finish line. But we need someone to do that.
Great answer, man. Let me also say, I didn't remember that I asked a first question, and you remember. Yeah, when it comes to messaging, that's clearly one of a major issue. I think the messaging is super jumbled, and I do believe that no one who woke up in the morning and had to decide whether they were going to pay for gas to go to work or I don't know, buy groceries that day should have to watch anyone from the administration on MSNBC or at the I call it the pulpit, the press sec room, and when they're asked about inflation, the response isn't something like articulating the actual reality of the economy, and talking about how it's not as bad as the global economy, but missing the sort of the humanistic or the opportunity that they could have to connect with somebody, right? Because when you hear when some folks in administration are sort of asked about inflation and the economy, and their direct response is rightfully, hey, it's booming, and they're comparing it to whenever, but there's never this, hey, American people, we see you. We see you struggling. We see you, and I think it just needs to be articulated more, because just as a regular average person, I think that people are really afraid, man. People are really scared. A lot of folks are scared about the future. Folks who otherwise would be involved politically are, I think, thankfully looking at their local races because they don't know what they're going to do with the national yet. I also think that people are, I don't know, I think that America has Stockholm syndrome. I think that a lot of people, when Trump kidnapped us for 4 years, I think that folks got really, really comfortable with chaos. And I feel like there are many, many people who I know who are logical, smart, voted for Hillary and Biden, who are now thinking about voting for Trump because I think they're afraid. I believe that, when it comes to, there are certain issues that I don't think the administration truly understands that the American public really cares about. And I think the safety part of this, whether it's local or global, is a big piece of this. I think that people are tired turning on the television and seeing war and protests, and people are tired. Yeah. And we've gotten this reprieve since Biden's been in office, generally when it comes to using his bully pulpit not to like bully people. But there's still this sense of, hey, I think that Trump might actually be more cogent, and his anger, combativeness, and sort of incendiary way of being may be an asset to America in a violent global, whatever. From a global perspective, I think people believe that Trump is like the strong man.
Yeah.
And I think it goes beyond just his his base. I see it among other people, and I think that's scary. And so I appreciate the sort of the way you articulated that, and I just wish that the administration would kind of take a few steps back and really sort of focus in on like what actual Americans are feeling, not just what they're saying, but what they're feeling. But
Well, I would say this one other thing is, you see it with the news where most times you're not going to turn on the news and see today was a sunny day,
Yeah.
it was great, and everything's nice, right? In many ways, Trump embodies the fears of many, and whether it's voters in favor of him or voters against him, he embodies the fear of many, and so that is often what the Biden administration has to go up against, is the emotional side of things, the fear that he invokes, and unfortunately, it's a really hard thing to combat, and it's really hard. One thing I learned running for office in the first instance, and right now, is it's hard to communicate complex topics, complex messaging. It really is.
Yeah.
And when you're running on a national stage or even locally, people want it in sound bites. And when it's in sound bites, the reality is that you can't have that discussion that's really needed.
Mm-hmm.
And what Trump has done is tapped into that emotional side of things that doesn't require much. It just does enough. And so that's, I think, the challenge that the administration
It's a
is
challenge. I think also that the world is changing, and we are becoming a more sort of informal from everything from the way people dress now at work to the way people uphold themselves on social media. I know you got to go soon. The way people uphold themselves on social media and how they and I think that I was working at the White House in the Office of Communications. I saw the challenges that I was a lowly researcher. I saw the challenges that the press secretary and the director of communications had, and there would be times where I said, "Look, just bring a brother in to just revamp the messaging," and I didn't have any power, but with my direct bosses, I would say, "Hey, this is great, but it's very presidential. I just should be right. Maybe that's for the website. Maybe when we're doing press releases, maybe when we're doing our tweets, we should be way less formal and just speak in plain language." And so I think that Trump came in and just, threw all conventions out the window. And, being from New York, I'm sure we grew up with him, right? So we knew he was a grifter coming in. But one thing he's good at is connecting and messaging to people in a way that they understand, and also in a way that energizes them. And I hadn't heard it that way, man. But he really is sort of this embodiment of fear on both sides.
I mean, you look at the example with John McCain when he corrected that woman, right? When she said, Obama's a bad man and all these other things, and he corrected her. And the reality is that what Trump does is he would say, if he was in his situation, he'd say, "You're right. You're right. Those fears that you have, you're right." And people want to believe that what they're thinking is right. Right? They don't want to believe they're wrong. They want to believe they're right. And he's going to tell them whatever they want to hear in order to get them to push back. And that's, that was the creation of disinformation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's always been propaganda, right? But he mastered the ability of hijacking people's emotions and allowing it to take control in a big way, And I think really those emotions really come down to really one big thing, and that is the fear of the browning of America. The fear of diversity, right? We see it happening all around us. It goes to the abortion issue. A large part of what pushed the initial pro-life movement initially was when the Immigration and Naturalization Act came in the 1970s. That act led to a diversity in the types of migrants and immigrants that were going to be coming and allowed into the U.S. A reaction that came from that was a desire to force white women who were the majority, and still are the majority in this country, population-wise, demographic-wise, to have kids because the birth rate was slowing, right? The birth rate's slowing as most developed nations happen, happens with most developed nations. The birth rate's slowing, so what do they need to do? They need to force these women to have kids so that the birth rate stays up, so that these immigrants that are coming into the country that don't look like us, who are having all these kids, they can't overtake us in the population. You look at the issue around immigration. That's a clear example of that. We saw Trump really phrase it when he said, S-hole countries, referring to really countries of minorities, right? DEI, this attack on diversity and equity and inclusion, talking about birtherism when President Obama was.
Dude, I was there. I mean, dude, it was insane. I was there. Not to cut you off, but it's something that we didn't know what was happening. You didn't know what was happening. You didn't know what that would become. Yeah. It just was so outrageous. Yeah. And I remember how we would come into the office, and I was a researcher and a veteran, and I did a lot of opposition research. Yeah. And so we did an opposition research report on Trump, which was insane. But anyway, I just remember how he completely shifted our work, our day to day, and it went from what is going on in the country, what is going on with the American people, and communicating to them to who the hell is this man? Like, really, what is he trying to do, and where is this headed? And it overtook at least the communications and press.
Because he hijacked their emotions.
He did.
He started early, and the reality is that's where it came from. When President Obama was elected, it put a lot of fear in certain people because it challenged the status quo. And there are a lot of people who don't like change. And that was part of his motto, right? Yes. So at the end of the day is that there are people who do not like change. And I saw that when I was at Villanova and I was waiting in line, and there was a young girl standing with her mother, and she was probably like 4 years old, and she turns around, she sees me, I'm wearing a suit with a tie, and she goes, and her mom's like, "What's gotten into you? What are you doing?" And she goes, "It's President Obama."
Just chilling.
Okay. Yeah, we were just standing there behind, and the mom was mortified. But I laughed because the reality is that from the stories that I heard my dad tell when a young white child saw a black man for the first time or a black person, there was fear, right? There was fear and concern, and this child was starstruck, right? And that told me there's a whole generation of kids that are growing up and they're learning who is the most powerful person in the world, an African American, in that moment, right? And so when you had those kids grow up, you see a situation where those parents that I talked about in Comac, where they may have said things that they wouldn't have said publicly, they said those things behind closed doors, and their child would say, "That's not right. I don't agree with that, Dad. Or Mom. That's ignorant. That's racist." And those parents started to think, "Who's brainwashing my kids? Who's brainwashing my kids against me?" Right? At the end of the day, somebody is telling my kids these things. And so the parental rights movement comes up, and that's when you see crazy ideas like in Florida, the benefits of slavery, because they're trying to essentially desensitize kids and get them to realize, don't feel so bad for those people. Yeah. They don't have it that bad. That's where it's all coming from, and it's all tied to that.
Wow. Well, on that note, man, where can people find you?
People can visit my website at nembhardforvirginia.com, all spelled out. That's NEMB, like boy, HARD. And really encourage you guys to come out and learn more about our campaign. We would love to have you on board as we begin this journey and start to build a pipeline for the next generation.
Cool, thanks. Thank you, man. Thanks, brother. That was a great closing.